There is a story that we are told about the 20th century. It is a story of liberation, of triumph, of justice finally served. We are told that in the 1960s, the great empires of Europe realized the error of their ways. We are told that the British and the French and the Belgians, confronted with the moral bankruptcy of colonialism and the rising tide of independence movements, lowered their flags and went home. We are told that the map of Africa was painted with new colors and that new nations were born into the family of free peoples. We see the black and white footage, grainy and flickering, of smiling presidents in crisp new suits shaking hands with departing governors in colonial whites. We hear the anthems of independence played by military bands, the crowds cheering, the flags rising on new poles in capital cities from Dakar to Kinshasa. We see the celebrations in the streets, the dancing, the hope burning bright in the eyes of millions who believe that a new day had finally dawned. But there is a flaw in this story. There is a ghost in the machine. There is something that the cameras did not capture, something that the history books glossed over, something that hides in plain sight on every banknote and every financial statement. Imagine for a moment that you are a young adult moving out of your parents' house. You have saved your money. You have planned for this moment. You pack your bags with excitement, feeling the weight of adulthood settling on your shoulders. You get your own apartment, perhaps a small studio with a window that looks out onto the street. You get a job, maybe not your dream job, but honest work that pays the bills. You feel free. You feel like you have finally become your own person. But then, just as you are settling into your new life, your father comes to visit. He sits you down at your kitchen table. He pours himself a cup of coffee without asking. And he tells you that there is a condition to your independence, a condition that was never mentioned before, a condition that changes everything. He says you can leave the house, yes. You can have your own apartment, your own life, your own identity. But you must keep your bank account under his name. He says that every month, without fail, you must deposit half of your salary into his account for safekeeping. He tells you that this is for your own good, for stability, for security. He says that if you want to spend your own money, you must ask for his permission. You must justify each expense. You must prove that you deserve access to the fruits of your own labor. And he says, with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes, that he has the right to decide what the value of your money is. He can devalue it whenever he sees fit. He can change the rules of the game without consulting you. Would you be free? Or would you be a prisoner in your own house, living in a gilded cage where the bars are made not of iron but of financial dependency? This is not a hypothetical scenario dreamed up for a philosophy class. This is not a thought experiment. This is the economic reality for 14 African nations today. It is a reality that affects 180 million people, mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, entrepreneurs and farmers, teachers and nurses, 180 million lives shaped by a monetary system that most of the world has never heard of. For decades, we have looked at the political map of Africa with furrowed brows and troubled hearts. We have looked at the coups and the wars and the grinding poverty, and we have asked why. Why does the continent blessed with the world's richest resources remain home to some of the world's poorest people? Why do governments fall like dominoes? Why does corruption seem endemic? Why does development remain so elusive? We have blamed corruption as if it were a disease native to African soil. We have blamed tribalism, as if ethnic identity were somehow more divisive in Africa than nationalism is in Europe. We have blamed the weather, the diseases, the geography. We have blamed the African leaders for their incompetence. We have blamed the African people for their supposed inability to govern themselves. But we rarely look at the money. We rarely follow the financial flows. We rarely ask who controls the printing presses, who sets the interest rates, who decides the value of a day's labor. If you look at the money, if you really look at it with clear eyes and an open mind, you will see a strange anomaly that defies the narrative of independence. You will see a currency that is used in the cocoa fields of Ivory Coast, where farmers wake before dawn to harvest the beans that will become European chocolate. You will see it in the oil fields of Gabon, where wells pump black gold from beneath the equatorial rainforest. You will see it in the uranium mines of Niger, where men dig radioactive ore that will power the lights of Paris. It is called the CFA Franc. Most people, even educated people who follow international affairs, think it is just a currency like the dollar or the yen or the pound, just another set of colored paper that people use to buy bread and pay rent. But it is not just a currency. It is a geopolitical umbilical cord that has never been cut. It is a mechanism that was designed in 1945 not to liberate Africa, but to keep it tethered to France forever. It is a financial architecture that has survived every independence movement, every revolution, every attempt at reform. This is the story of the invisible empire. This is the story of how Paris managed to leave Africa physically, but stay financially. How the tricolor flag came down from the government buildings, but the economic control remained as tight as ever. This is the story of the colonial tax that never ended, the tribute that is still being paid, the sovereignty that was promised but never delivered. To understand how this system works, to truly grasp the elegant brutality of its design, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a time when the world was burning, when the old order was collapsing, when everything seemed possible and nothing seemed certain. It is 1945. The Second World War has just ended. The guns have fallen silent across Europe, but the echoes of the explosions still ring in everyone's ears. France has been devastated. For 4 long years, the Nazis had occupied Paris, marching their jack-booted soldiers down the Champs-Élysées, while the French people watched in humiliation and rage. The French economy is in ruins. The factories bombed, the infrastructure shattered, the national treasury empty. General Charles de Gaulle, tall and austere and burning with wounded pride, is trying to rebuild not just a country, but the very idea of French greatness. He is trying to restore the pride of a broken nation that has watched its army crumble, its government flee, its capital turned into a Nazi playground. He looks at the world with the eyes of a strategist, and he sees a terrifying reality. The United States and the Soviet Union are the new superpowers, giants who bestride the world like colossi. France, once the center of civilization, the city of lights, the standard bearer of European culture, is now small. France is weak. France is a second-tier power. But de Gaulle has a plan. He is a man who believes in grandeur, in the destiny of nations, in the importance of maintaining rank among the powers of the world. He believes that France can only be a great power if it has an empire, if it has resources to command, if it has territories that acknowledge French sovereignty. He calls it the pré carré, the backyard, the square garden, the protected zone. He believes that the vast territories of West and Central Africa, lands of forest and savanna and desert, are the battery that will power the French recovery. They will provide the raw materials for French industry. They will provide markets for French goods. They will provide the geopolitical weight that will keep France relevant in the councils of the powerful. But the world is changing faster than de Gaulle would like. The Americans, who emerged from the war as the undisputed leaders of the Western world, are pushing for decolonization. They see empires as relics of the past, obstacles to trade, breeding grounds for communism. The people of Africa themselves are demanding freedom, inspired by the rhetoric of self-determination that the Allies used to fight fascism. If the war was fought for freedom, they ask, why are we not free? The question hangs in the air like smoke that cannot be dispersed. De Gaulle knows he cannot keep the colonies by force alone. The war in Algeria, which will rage for 8 bloody years and tear France apart from within, will later prove that military occupation is too expensive and too bloody for a modern democracy to sustain. French mothers will not tolerate watching their sons come home in coffins from wars in distant deserts. So he devises a genius strategy, a strategy that will prove more durable than any colonial army. He decides to give the colonies their political independence, but keep their economic dependence intact. He decides to create a system where the African leaders will be sovereign in name, able to sit in the United Nations and vote on resolutions, but servants in practice, answering to Paris on every economic question that truly matters. On December 26, 1945, while Europe was still digging itself out of the rubble of war, the French government created a new currency for its African colonies. They called it the CFA Franc. At the time, with no shame and no attempt at subtlety, the acronym stood for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, the French colonies of Africa. The name itself was a statement of ownership, a declaration that these territories and their economies belonged to France as surely as if they were departments of metropolitan France itself. When the 1960s arrived and the winds of change swept across the continent, when the flags were changed in elaborate ceremonies attended by dignitaries from around the world, the name of the currency was changed too. It became the Financial Community of Africa for the West African Zone and the Financial Cooperation in Central Africa for the Central African Zone. It was a clever rebranding, the kind of linguistic sleight of hand that public relations experts admire. It sounded like a partnership. It sounded like a voluntary union of equals choosing to work together for mutual benefit. But the mechanics of the system did not change. Not one gear, not one wire, not one regulation. The cage was painted a different color, bright and modern and optimistic, but the bars remained the same. The lock remained firmly in place, and the key remained in Paris. Let us look at how this trap is constructed, how this invisible prison is built. It is not a simple thing. It is an elegant system designed by clever men who understood economics and power. It is built on 4 pillars, 4 rules that were written in the carpeted offices of Paris and imposed on the African capitals with the force of treaty law. This is the most controversial part of the system, the beating heart of the mechanism, the part that generates the most anger when people finally understand what it means. For decades, the French government required the African nations to deposit a massive percentage of their foreign exchange reserves into the French Treasury in Paris. Let me explain what that means in plain English, in words that anyone can understand regardless of their education in economics. When a country like Ivory Coast sells cocoa to the world, when farmers harvest the pods, dry the beans, load them onto ships bound for Europe, they get paid in dollars or euros. Hard currency that can be used to buy anything from anyone. That money becomes part of their foreign reserve, their national savings account. It is the money they should be able to use to build hospitals or buy medicine or pay for infrastructure. It is the rainy day fund, the emergency cushion, the strategic reserve that every sovereign nation needs to weather storms and seize opportunities. But under the rules of the CFA Franc, these nations were not allowed to keep that money in their own central bank, in their own vaults, under their own control. They had to send it to France, not as a loan, not as an investment that they chose to make, but as a mandatory deposit, a requirement written into the treaty that they had to accept if they wanted to use the currency. For many years, during the height of the system, the requirement was 100%. Every single dollar that these countries earned from their exports, every cent of foreign currency that came into their economy, had to be sent to Paris. Imagine that, a supposedly independent nation that cannot hold its own money. Later, after protests and pressure, it was lowered to 65%. Then, in more recent years, to 50%. Imagine that. Imagine it in human terms, not in the abstract language of central banking. For more than half a century, 14 African nations had to send half of all their wealth, all their earnings, all the fruit of their labor, to a bank account in France. They were effectively paying France to hold their own money. The central banks in Dakar and Abidjan and Yaoundé and Libreville had vaults that sat empty while their reserves sat in Paris. The French government, when confronted with this fact, when challenged by critics, argues that this is not a tax. They say the word tax is inflammatory and inaccurate. They say it is a guarantee, a service, a stabilization mechanism. They say that in exchange for holding the money, France guarantees the convertibility of the currency, ensures that it remains stable, provides a backstop against speculation. They say it provides stability in a volatile world, that it protects African economies from the kind of currency crashes that have devastated other developing nations. But the critics call it something else. They call it a ransom. They call it tribute. They call it by its proper name, theft. They point out that the French Treasury takes this money, billions and billions of dollars accumulated over decades, and invests it. They put it into the French stock market. They use it to pay down French debt. They use it to finance French development projects. For decades, France was making money, earning interest and returns off the African reserves, while the African nations themselves had to go to international banks and borrow money at high interest rates, sometimes double-digit interest rates, to build roads, to construct power plants, to finance the basic infrastructure that any modern economy needs. It is a paradox that defies logic and morality. Poor countries are financing a rich country. The colonized are subsidizing the colonizer. The money flows uphill from the villages of the Sahel to the boulevards of Paris. The CFA franc is not a free-floating currency whose value is determined by the market, by the laws of supply and demand, by the productivity of the economies that use it. Its value is fixed, pegged to another currency by government decree. Originally, it was fixed to the French franc at a specific exchange rate that never changed. Now it is fixed to the euro at the rate of 625.957 CFA francs to 1 euro. On the surface, this sounds good. It sounds like stability, like protection from chaos. It means that the money doesn't fluctuate wildly from day to day. It means that inflation is kept low, that prices remain relatively predictable. If you live in Senegal, the price of a baguette doesn't double overnight like it might in Zimbabwe, during hyperinflation, or in Venezuela during economic collapse. But in economics, as in life, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every benefit has a cost. Every stability has a price. The price of this monetary stability is economic stagnation, the slow suffocation of local industry, the permanent consignment to the bottom of the global value chain. Because the CFA franc is tied to the euro, it is a very strong currency, much stronger than it would be if it reflected the actual productivity of the economies that use it. The euro is designed for the economies of Germany and France, for advanced industrial powerhouses with high productivity, sophisticated manufacturing, strong export sectors. It is designed for countries that make cars and machines and pharmaceuticals. It is not designed for agricultural economies in the tropics that are still trying to climb the development ladder. A strong currency is a disaster for a developing nation trying to industrialize. It makes your exports expensive on the global market. If you are a cotton farmer in Mali, waking up before dawn to work fields that your family has worked for generations, or a coffee grower in Cameroon tending trees on a misty mountainside, you are competing with farmers in Vietnam or Brazil or India. If your currency is artificially high because it is pegged to the euro, your cotton is too expensive for the global market. Your coffee cannot compete on price. You cannot win. The market is rigged against you before you even begin. At the same time, a strong currency makes imports cheap. It becomes cheaper to buy frozen chicken from Europe, shipped across the ocean in refrigerated containers. than to raise chicken in Africa. It becomes cheaper to buy furniture from France, manufactured in efficient European factories, than to build a furniture factory in Gabon and employ local workers. It becomes cheaper to import fabric from China than to build textile mills in Senegal. So the mechanism of the currency kills the local industry before it can even be born. It turns these economies into supermarkets for French goods, into dumping grounds for European exports. It keeps them trapped in a cycle where they sell raw materials, cocoa, coffee, cotton, oil, uranium, and buy finished products, machinery, cars, medicines, processed food. They sell the wood and buy the table. They sell the cotton and buy the shirt. They sell the oil and buy the plastic. They sell the cocoa and buy the chocolate. This is not an accident of economics. This is not an unfortunate side effect that nobody anticipated. This is the design. This is the intention. It is the classic colonial economic model preserved in amber, frozen in time, perpetuated by treaty law and monetary policy. It is the model that says that Africa provides raw materials and Europe adds the value. It is the model that ensures that the profits, the jobs, the technology, the advancement all stay in the global north, while the global south remains permanently impoverished. The rules of the CFA zone allow for the free movement of capital back to France without any restrictions, without any controls, without any questions asked. This means that French companies operating in Africa can take their profits out of the country instantly, can wire millions of euros to Paris with a few keystrokes, can extract the wealth they generate, and face no barriers, no taxes, no requirements to reinvest locally. If a French company builds a port in Lomé paving over the coastline and installing massive cranes to load and unload container ships, or runs a phone network in Dakar, stringing cables and erecting cell towers across the city, they can take the money they make and wire it instantly to Paris. Every franc of profit, every euro of earnings. They don't have to reinvest it in the local economy. They don't have to build schools or hospitals. They don't have to train local workers or develop local suppliers. They can simply extract and leave like miners stripping a mountain and moving on. This creates a massive capital flight, a hemorrhaging of wealth that has continued for decades. It is like a bleeding wound that never heals, that slowly drains the life from the body. The wealth is generated in Africa. The sweat of African workers, the resources of African soil, the intelligence of African engineers. But it does not stay in Africa. It does not accumulate. It does not compound. It flows north, across the Mediterranean, back to the old master. It flows to shareholders in Paris and Lyon and Marseille, who have never set foot in Africa, but who collect dividends from African labor. For decades, the boards of the central banks in West and Central Africa were not fully sovereign institutions. They had French representatives sitting at the table, men in expensive suits who had flown in from Paris, who reported to the French Treasury. These French officials had veto power over major decisions. No major decision about monetary policy, about interest rates, about reserve requirements, about lending standards, could be made without the approval of Paris. Imagine if the United States Federal Reserve, the institution that controls the dollar and shapes American monetary policy, had a British official sitting on the board who could say no to interest rate changes. It would be unthinkable. It would be considered a violation of sovereignty so fundamental that it would spark a constitutional crisis. Americans would be in the streets demanding independence. But in Africa, this was accepted as normal for decades. It was written into the treaties. It was the price of stability, the cost of using the CFA franc. It was the admission fee to the club. But stability for whom? Security for whose benefit? The defenders of the CFA franc, and there are many French officials, African leaders who benefit from the system, economists who believe in hard currency discipline, always point to inflation as their trump card. They say, look at the neighbors. Look at Ghana, where the cedi has crashed. Look at Nigeria, where the naira has lost value year after year, where inflation eats away at savings, where prices rise faster than wages. Look at Zimbabwe, where hyperinflation destroyed the currency entirely, where people became millionaires and billionaires but couldn't afford bread. The CFA countries are stable. Their money holds value. You can plan for the future. This is true as far as it goes. The CFA franc has provided monetary stability. But stability is not the same as growth. Stability is not the same as prosperity. Stability is not the same as development. You can be stable and poor. You can be stable and stagnant. You can be stable and hopeless. The cemetery is a very stable place, but nobody wants to live there. The reality is that for 60 years, for 3 full generations, the CFA nations have largely failed to industrialize. They have remained exporters of raw materials, producers of unprocessed commodities, hewers of wood and drawers of water. They have remained at the bottom of the value chain, watching other nations, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, Vietnam, leap ahead, transform their economies, lift millions out of poverty. Why? Why have the CFA nations remained stuck while Asia advanced? The answer is complex, but the currency system is a major part of it. The straitjacket of the peg, the requirement to maintain reserves in Paris, the conservative monetary policy designed for European conditions, all of this has prevented the kind of aggressive development financing that Asian countries use to build their economies. And whenever a leader tried to break these chains, whenever a president stood up and said enough, the consequences were severe and swift. This brings us to the dark history of the CFA franc, the history that is not written in the economic textbooks used in business schools, the history that is not discussed at International Monetary Fund conferences, the history of blood and coups, of assassinations and interventions, of leaders who tried to claim sovereignty and paid with their lives. Let us look at the case of Togo, a small sliver of a country wedged between Ghana and Benin on the West African coast. It is 1963. Togo has been independent for just 3 years. Its president is a man named Sylvanus Olympio, a man who believed in the promise of independence, who thought that the flags and the anthems actually meant something. Olympio was a brilliant man by any measure. He was a graduate of the London School of Economics, one of the world's most prestigious universities. He spoke perfect English and French and German, moving between languages with the ease of the truly educated. He was not a radical revolutionary calling for socialist revolution. He was not a hothead demanding instant transformation. He was a pragmatist, a moderate, a man who believed in economics and development and gradual progress. But Olympio realized, as he studied the books and looked at the money flows, that true independence was impossible without financial independence. He looked at the CFA system with the eyes of an economist, and he saw a trap, an elegant trap, but a trap nonetheless. He famously said that he did not want Togo to be a part of the French club, that membership came with too high a price. He decided that Togo would create its own currency, that it would print its own money, that it would leave the CFA zone and strike out on its own path. He planned carefully. He built relationships with other nations. He began to print the new Togolese money. He signed agreements with countries willing to back his new economy. He was methodical, careful, trying to avoid the economic chaos that could come from a poorly planned monetary transition. On January 13, 1963, just days before he was scheduled to sign the final agreements that would formalize Togo's departure from the CFA zone, a group of soldiers stormed his house in the dark hours before dawn. Olympio woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting. He tried to escape, running through his own home in his nightclothes. He jumped over the wall of his garden and hid near the gate of the American embassy, hoping that the Americans would protect him, hoping that the sanctity of diplomatic property would save his life. He was waiting for the embassy to open so he could ask for asylum, crouching in the shadows as the sun began to rise over Lomé. But the soldiers found him first. They shot him dead outside the embassy gate, his blood soaking into the dust of the street. He was 44 years old. He had been president for 3 years. He died trying to give his country its own currency. It was the first coup d'etat in the history of independent West Africa, a precedent that would be followed again and again in the decades to come. The man who led the soldiers was a former French legionnaire named Gnassingbé Eyadema, a man who had learned his craft in the armies of France. He would go on to rule Togo for 38 years as a faithful ally of France, crushing dissent, rigging elections, enriching himself while his people remained poor. The new currency that Olympio had planned was destroyed. The printing plates were smashed. Togo remained in the CFA zone. The message was sent to every other African leader who might have harbored similar thoughts. This is what happens when you challenge the system. Then there is the case of Mali, a landlocked nation in the heart of West Africa, a country of ancient trading cities and desert nomads. The first president of Mali was Modibo Keïta, a proud nationalist who had fought for independence, who believed in African socialism and Pan-African unity. In 1962, he made a bold decision. He announced that Mali would leave the CFA zone. He announced the creation of the Malian franc, a new currency that would be controlled by Malians for the benefit of Mali. The French response was brutal, but it was not a military invasion. France had learned from the disaster in Algeria that direct military intervention was costly and could turn into a quagmire. Instead, they waged economic warfare, a bloodless but devastating campaign. France refused to convert the new Malian currency. They blocked trade routes. They cut off access to international markets. They pressured other nations not to deal with Mali. The Malian economy was suffocated like a man with a pillow over his face. Inflation spiraled out of control as the government printed money to try to keep services running. The shops were empty. The warehouses were bare. People went hungry. Keïta fought for 6 years, trying to keep his country's independence, trying to weather the storm. But the pressure was too much. The economy was collapsing. His own people were suffering. In 1967, he was forced to capitulate, to admit defeat, to crawl back to the system he had tried to escape. He agreed to rejoin the CFA zone. He agreed to devalue his currency. He agreed to let French overseers back into the central bank to monitor every decision. It was a humiliation that broke him, and it wasn't enough to save him. A year later, in 1968, he was overthrown in a coup by a military officer named Moussa Traoré, a man who had served in the French army. Keita died in prison in 1977, the official cause of death given as natural causes. Few believed it. These stories became legends in West Africa, whispered in government offices and military barracks. They were the warning signs written in blood. They told every future president, every minister of finance, every ambitious reformer that the door to the bank vault was locked and that trying to pick the lock was suicide. They created a culture of fear, a tacit understanding that some things could not be challenged. For decades, the system held firm, unshakable, seemingly permanent. The French government maintained a network of influence known in hushed tones as Françafrique, France-Africa, a single word that captured the permanent entanglement of the two continents. It was a shadowy web of diplomats and spies and businessmen and mercenaries, a parallel government that operated in the shadows of official diplomacy. The architect of this system was a man named Jacques Foccart, a secretive figure who served as the advisor to de Gaulle and his successors for decades. He was known as the man of the shadows, the spider at the center of the web. He kept files on every African president. He knew their secrets, their mistresses, their bank accounts. He kept the African presidents in line through a combination of carrots and sticks, rewards and threats. If you were a good friend to France, if you protected French economic interests, if you voted with France at the United Nations, you could rule for 40 years. You could steal from your people and buy apartments in Paris and send your children to expensive Swiss schools, and France would look the other way. French intelligence would even help you crush your opponents. French mercenaries would protect you from coups. But if you threatened the economic interests of France, if you talked about nationalizing French companies, if you threatened the CFA Franc, if you tried to chart an independent course, you were removed. Sometimes through coups, sometimes through assassinations, sometimes through economic strangulation. The methods varied, but the result was always the same. The system was perfect for France. It provided a captive market for French goods, French cars, French medicines, French machinery. It provided cheap uranium from Niger for French nuclear power plants, ensuring that the lights stayed on in Paris. It provided oil from Gabon and Chad. It provided diplomatic support at the United Nations, where 14 votes could be counted on to support French positions. It provided contracts for French construction companies. It provided a sphere of influence that made France more important in global affairs than its actual size would warrant. But for the people of Africa, it was a tragedy that played out in slow motion over decades. It meant that their economies were run for the benefit of others. It meant that their savings were sitting in Paris, earning interest for the French Treasury while they lacked schools and hospitals. It meant that they were passengers in their own vehicle, watching someone else drive while they sat in the back seat. And then came the betrayal, the moment when the mask slipped, when the pretense of partnership was revealed as a lie. If there was one argument that the defenders of the system used above all others, one justification that was supposed to make the whole arrangement acceptable, it was the guarantee. They said, yes, you give up your sovereignty. Yes, you follow rules made in Paris. Yes, you keep your reserves in France. But in exchange, France treats your money as equal to theirs. One CFA franc is always worth a fixed amount of French francs. It is a sacred bond, an unbreakable promise. Your money is as safe as French money. You have the backing of the French state. In 1994, that bond was broken. That promise was shattered. The sacred guarantee was revealed as contingent, revocable, subject to the interests of Paris. It was a cold day in January, the kind of winter day when the wind blows off the Atlantic and cuts through clothing. The African heads of state were summoned to Dakar in Senegal. They were told that they were going to a conference to discuss cooperation, to talk about development, to celebrate the partnership between France and Africa. They flew in from their capitals, expecting handshakes and photo opportunities. When they arrived at the conference hall, they were ushered into a room with the French Prime Minister and the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. The atmosphere was tense. There was no small talk, no diplomatic pleasantries. They were told to sit down, and then they were told the news, delivered bluntly, without apology. France had decided to devalue the CFA franc, not by 10%, not by 20%, by 50%. 5-0, cut in half. In the blink of an eye, overnight, without consultation, the money in the pockets of millions of Africans lost half its value. Imagine you go to sleep, and you have enough money saved to buy a bag of rice, to pay your rent, to send your child to school. You wake up and you can only buy half a bag. Your rent has effectively doubled. The school fees are now out of reach. The shock was devastating, seismic, earth-shattering. The price of medicine doubled overnight. The price of fuel doubled. The savings of a lifetime were wiped out. Retirement accounts became worthless. College funds evaporated. For the middle class, teachers and nurses and small business owners who had worked hard and saved carefully, it was a catastrophe. The students studying abroad in France and Belgium had to come home because their parents could no longer pay the tuition in the new devalued currency. Businesses that had borrowed money to buy machines suddenly found their debts had doubled in real terms. Families that had scrimped and saved to buy a house watched their down payment become worthless. The African presidents tried to resist. They argued. They pleaded. They protested that this violated the fundamental promise of the system. But they were told they had no choice, that the decision had been made, that it was final. It was a decision made in Paris and Washington by the French government and the International Monetary Fund. The logic was cold economics, the language of technocrats who dealt in abstractions rather than human lives. The IMF in France argued that the CFA was overvalued, that it was hurting exports, that devaluing it would boost competitiveness and growth. But for the common man in the street, for the mother trying to feed her children, for the old man who had saved all his life, it felt like a robbery. It felt like the rich nations of the North reaching into the pockets of the poor and taking what they wanted. It proved once and for all that the so-called partnership was a lie. When the going got tough, when France faced economic pressures of its own, when the interests of Paris conflicted with the interests of Abidjan or Dakar, France protected its own interests and threw the African economies under the bus without a second thought. The devaluation of 1994 was the moment the psychological link was broken for a generation of Africans. It was the moment when people realized, with the clarity of lived experience, that the CFA franc was not their money. It was a tool of control, and that tool could be used against them at any moment without warning, without their consent. But the system survived even this betrayal. The elites in the African capitals were too dependent on French support to leave. Their own wealth was often held in France. Their children went to French schools. Their interests were tied to the continuation of the system. They swallowed the bitter pill and carried on, while their people suffered. Then came the next great shift, another transformation that would make the system even more absurd: the birth of the euro. In 1999, France gave up its own currency in a historic move. The French franc, which had existed in various forms since the French Revolution, disappeared. It was replaced by the euro, a new currency shared with Germany and Italy and Spain and other European nations. This created a bizarre legal situation, an anomaly that defied economic logic. The CFA franc was now pegged to a currency that France did not control. It was pegged to the euro, a currency managed by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. This meant that the monetary policy of West Africa was now being determined by the European Central Bank, by bankers in Germany who were making decisions based on the needs of the German economy. Think about the absurdity of this for a moment. The interest rates for a village in Burkina Faso, for a farmer trying to get a loan to buy a new plow, were being decided by bankers in Frankfurt who were worried about inflation in Berlin. The monetary policy of Senegal was being set by officials who were thinking about unemployment in Greece and growth in the Netherlands. The euro is a very hard currency, one of the hardest in the world. It is managed by Germans who have a cultural and historical fear of inflation, dating back to the Weimar Republic. This obsession with low inflation, this conservative monetary policy, is fine for a developed economy with high productivity and strong institutions. But for a developing economy, it is a straitjacket that prevents growth. Developing countries often need a little inflation, need loose monetary policy to stimulate growth. They need to be able to print money to build infrastructure, to finance development projects, to create jobs. A little inflation is the price of rapid growth, the lubricant that allows an economy to expand quickly. But the CFA rules forbid this. The central banks in Dakar and Yaoundé have to follow the strict rules of the Eurozone. They have to prioritize low inflation over job creation. They have to prioritize stability over growth. They have to maintain high reserve requirements that limit lending. The result is a permanent credit crunch, a scarcity of capital that strangles entrepreneurship. If you are a young entrepreneur in Senegal and you have a great idea for a business, maybe a factory to process local mangoes into juice, maybe a tech startup to provide mobile services, maybe a small manufacturing operation, it is almost impossible to get a loan. The interest rates are too high, often 15 or 20%. The banks are too conservative, too risk-averse. They prefer to lend to the government or to established French companies. They have to keep their reserves high to satisfy the rules of the peg. So the business doesn't get built, the factory doesn't get opened, the jobs don't get created, and the young man who could have been an entrepreneur, who could have employed dozens of people, ends up getting on a boat to try to migrate to Europe, risking his life crossing the Mediterranean. It is a cruel cycle. The monetary policy forces the youth to migrate. And then Europe spends millions of euros trying to stop the migration, building walls and deploying coast guards and making deals with dictators to keep the migrants away. By the 2010s, a new generation was rising in Africa. A generation that did not remember the colonial era firsthand, that had grown up in independent nations and took independence for granted. A generation that was connected to the internet, that could see how other developing nations were advancing, that could compare their situation to countries in Asia and Latin America. A generation that was not afraid of the old ghosts, that did not carry the psychological scars of colonialism. They started to ask questions that their parents had been afraid to ask. They asked why their presidents had to fly to Paris every year to report on the economy like schoolboys reporting to the headmaster. They asked why their money was printed in a factory in Chamalières, in central France, a small town that most Africans had never heard of. Yes, that is true. The physical notes of the CFA Franc, the actual paper money that people hold in their hands, are printed in France. A sovereign nation like Ivory Coast, a country of 25 million people, does not even print its own banknotes. They are imported like shoes or cars, shipped across the ocean in secure containers. This new generation started to protest. They formed movements with names like France dégage, France get out. They organized demonstrations in the capitals. They burned CFA notes in the streets, the flames consuming the symbols of monetary slavery. They called for the end of the colonial currency. They demanded economic independence to match political independence. One of the loudest voices was a man named Kemi Seba, a controversial figure, a Pan-Africanist activist who dressed in traditional African clothing and gave fiery speeches that went viral on social media. In 2017, he publicly burned a 5,000 CFA note at a rally in Senegal, holding the burning bill aloft as the crowd cheered. He was arrested within hours. The central bank filed a complaint saying that he was destroying public property, that burning currency was a crime. But the image went viral across the continent. It was shared millions of times on Facebook and Twitter. It ignited a debate that could no longer be suppressed, that could no longer be confined to academic journals and policy papers. The issue had entered the popular consciousness. Intellectuals and economists joined the fight. They published books with titles like Africa's Last Colonial Currency and The Pillage Continues. They published articles in newspapers and magazines exposing the mechanisms of the operations account, showing the data, proving with graphs and statistics that the system was draining billions of dollars from the continent every year. They appeared on television debates. They gave lectures at universities. They built a movement. The pressure was building like steam in a sealed container. The French government could feel the heat. French diplomats reported growing anti-French sentiment. French companies operating in Africa reported increasing hostility. Emmanuel Macron, the young French president who had come to power promising to reinvent French politics, realized that the old way was no longer sustainable. He saw that anti-French sentiment was exploding across the Sahel. He saw Russian flags being waved in Bamako and Ouagadougou, replacing the French flags that had once flown there. He saw French influence slipping away. He knew he had to do something. He had to change the narrative. He had to appear to be listening, to be reforming, to be granting the concessions that the African youth were demanding. So in December 2019, he made a surprise announcement that made headlines around the world. He flew to Abidjan and stood next to the president of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, in a carefully staged ceremony. He declared the end of the CFA Franc with great fanfare. He said the name would change. It would be called the ECO, evoking the English word economy, and suggesting a modern, forward-looking currency. He said the requirement to deposit 50% of reserves in Paris would end. He said the French representatives would leave the board of the central bank, that Africa would have full sovereignty over its monetary policy. It sounded like a historic victory. It sounded like the end of the empire. It sounded like the ghost had finally been exorcised. But was it? The announcement of the ECO was greeted with applause in the presidential palace in Abidjan. The cameras flashed, capturing the handshake between Macron and Ouattara. The champagne was poured in cut crystal glasses. President Macron spoke eloquently of a new era, of partnership rather than paternalism. He spoke of cutting the umbilical cord, of France and Africa walking forward together as equals. He said that France did not want to be the master anymore, that the colonial era was truly over. He said that the 50% deposit rule, that hated mechanism that had drained billions from Africa, was gone forever. He said that the French officials were leaving the board, that African central banks would be fully sovereign. For a moment, it seemed like the critics had won. It seemed like the invisible empire was finally dissolving, that the cage door was swinging open, that freedom was at hand. But then the economists looked at the fine print. They looked at the actual details of the agreement, reading the technical language carefully, and they stopped clapping. They realized that while the furniture was being rearranged, while the curtains were being changed, the house remained the same. The structure was intact. The most important pillar of the system, the fundamental mechanism of control, had not been touched: the peg. Under the new rules, the ECO would still be pegged to the euro. Its value would still be fixed by the European Central Bank. It would still be a hard currency designed for German industry, not for African agriculture. It would still be managed according to European priorities, not African needs. This meant that the fundamental economic trap remained unchanged. The African nations would still have an overvalued currency that made their exports expensive and their imports cheap. They would still be unable to compete in the global export market. They would still be dependent on importing goods from Europe. They would still be trapped at the bottom of the value chain, selling raw materials and buying finished products. Critics called it a rebranding exercise, a cosmetic change that left the substance untouched. They said it was like changing the label on a bottle of poison. The name on the label is different, but the liquid inside is the same. The poison still kills. They pointed out that France still provided the guarantee of convertibility. This sounds like a generous gift, like France doing Africa a favor. But in the world of finance, a guarantee is a leash. If France guarantees the currency, France ultimately controls the risk. And if France controls the risk, France will still demand oversight, will still insist on having a say in monetary policy, will still maintain influence over the central banks. The French officials might leave the physical boardroom, might stop sitting at the table during meetings, but the reporting requirements would remain. The invisible hand of the French Treasury would still be there, hovering over the ledgers, ensuring that the policies of Abidjan and Dakar did not threaten the stability of the euro connection. And there was another problem, a political dimension that revealed the cynicism of the whole exercise: the name itself. The name ECO was not invented by France. It was not Macron's idea. It was a name that had been chosen years earlier by the entire West African community, including English-speaking countries like Nigeria and Ghana and Gambia. They had been planning for years to create a truly regional currency, a currency that would unite the whole of West Africa, not just the former French colonies, a currency that would be independent of Europe, managed by Africans for Africans. By suddenly adopting the name ECO for the reformed CFA Franc, France and Ivory Coast had effectively hijacked the project. They had taken the name that belonged to the whole region and attached it to the old colonial structure. It was a clever political move, a way to claim the mantle of reform while preserving the substance of control. Nigeria, the giant of West Africa with a population of over 200 million people, was furious. The English-speaking nations felt betrayed, ambushed, outmaneuvered. They saw it as a French maneuver to divide the region, to prevent a true West African Union that would be dominated by Nigeria rather than France. So instead of bringing unity, the reform brought division. It drew a line in the sand between the friends of Paris and the rest of the continent. It poisoned the well of regional cooperation. But the anger in the streets was about more than just currency pegs and central bank boards. The CFA franc had become a symbol, a powerful symbol that concentrated all the frustrations and humiliations of the post-colonial era. A symbol of a much deeper malaise. It was a symbol of the fact that 60 years after independence, 60 years after the flags were raised and the anthems were sung, France still owned the commanding heights of the economy in Francophone Africa. Look at the infrastructure of Francophone Africa today. Who runs the ports where the container ships dock and the cranes load and unload? Who runs the railways that carry freight and passengers across the savannah? Who runs the logistics companies that move goods from the interior to the coast? For decades, the answer was almost always the same: French companies. The port of Abidjan, the economic heart of Ivory Coast, is managed by a French company called Bolloré. The port of Douala in Cameroon was managed by a French company for years until recent reforms. The railways in many countries are operated by French subsidiaries. The telecommunications networks are often owned by Orange, a French giant that dominates the mobile phone market across West Africa. The construction contracts for the big bridges and the highways and the government buildings often go to French firms like Bouygues and Vinci. The electricity companies are often French. The water companies are often French. The critics argue that the CFA system creates a comfortable playground for these companies, a protected market where they can operate with minimal risk. Because the currency is freely convertible and stable, pegged to the euro, it is safe for them to invest. They can extract their profits easily through the free transfer rules. They don't have to worry about currency risk, about exchange rate fluctuations, about capital controls. It is a system built for the foreign investor, not for the local worker. It is designed to protect the interests of French shareholders, not to create jobs for African youth. And this economic dominance translates into political interference. This is the shadow of Françafrique that still stretches across the continent. The people looked at their leaders and they saw puppets dancing on French strings. They saw presidents who seemed more interested in pleasing the Élysée Palace than pleasing their own voters. They saw leaders who sent their children to expensive schools in France, while the schools in their own countries lacked books and chairs, who bought villas on the French Riviera, while their people lived in slums, who kept their stolen money in French banks while lecturing their citizens about sacrifice and austerity. There is a feeling of humiliation that burns in the chest of the youth, a feeling of being second-class citizens in their own country, a feeling of watching foreigners get rich off their labor while they struggle to find work, a feeling of powerlessness, of being trapped in a system that was designed before they were born and that they seem unable to change. And this humiliation has consequences, explosive consequences. We are seeing them play out right now across the Sahel, the semi-arid region south of the Sahara, where the desert meets the grassland. Look at Mali. Look at Burkina Faso. Look at Niger. In the last few years, these countries have been rocked by military coups, by angry young officers seizing power at the barrel of a gun and announcing to cheering crowds that they are taking back their sovereignty. In the old days, during the Cold War era, France would have intervened immediately. They would have sent the paratroopers from their bases in Djibouti or Chad. They would have restored the friendly president to power, possibly after a few token reforms to satisfy international opinion. This was the pattern that had held for decades, but this time is different. This time, everything has changed. When the crowds poured into the streets of Bamako to celebrate the coup in Mali, they were not carrying French flags. They were burning French flags, setting them alight and dancing around the flames. They were tearing down French street signs. They were vandalizing French businesses. They were carrying Russian flags. Why Russia? Why would Africans in Bamako wave the flag of a country on the other side of the world, a country that has no historical connection to Mali? It is not because they love Vladimir Putin. Most of them know very little about Russia beyond what they see in the news. It is not because they believe Russia will help them develop their economy. It is because Russia is not France. Russia is the anti-France. Russia represents a different option, a way to break the monopoly. The arrival of the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary army in Mali, was a geopolitical earthquake. It was a signal that shocked Paris and Washington. It meant that the monopoly was over, that France's privileged position was ended. The African leaders realized they had options. They didn't have to take orders from Paris anymore. They could hire Russian guns to fight their wars against jihadist insurgents. They could sell their gold to Dubai. They could sell their oil to China. They could play the great powers against each other. The invisible empire is cracking. The walls are coming down. The system that seemed so permanent, so unshakable, is collapsing. France is in a state of shock and denial. The French Foreign Ministry issues statements expressing concern. French officials give interviews warning about the danger of Russian influence. They are being evicted from their own backyard, expelled from the Pré Carré that de Gaulle considered essential to French greatness. The French ambassador was expelled from Mali, told to pack his bags and leave. The French troops that had been stationed in the Sahel to fight terrorism were ordered to leave Burkina Faso, their bases shut down. The uranium mines in Niger that provide fuel for French nuclear reactors are under threat, with the new military government demanding better terms. President Macron warned that Russia was a predatory power. He warned that Wagner was a gang of criminals who would exploit Africa even worse than the colonial powers. He spoke of shared values between France and Africa, of democracy and human rights. But the message fell on deaf ears. The people of the Sahel replied that they had lived with a predator for 100 years. They said they were willing to try a new devil because they were so tired of the old one. They said that France had no moral authority to lecture them about exploitation. This is the price of the CFA Franc. This is the price of holding on too tight for too long. This is the price of the operations account and the peg and the arrogance of thinking that Africa would remain subordinate forever. By holding on too tight, by refusing to grant true economic independence, France has lost everything. The backlash is sweeping them off the continent, erasing decades of carefully cultivated influence in a matter of months. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. France and Africa share a language, French spoken by millions across the continent. They share aspects of culture, of cuisine, of legal systems. There are millions of people of African descent living in France, making their lives in Paris and Marseille, contributing to French society. There is a deep human connection, families split between continents, children who are both African and French. But you cannot build a friendship on a foundation of exploitation. You cannot be partners when one holds the keys to the other's bank account. You cannot expect gratitude when you're taking more than you give. The relationship has to be rebuilt on a new basis, or it will end completely. So what is the future? Where does this story go from here? The future is uncertain, clouded, difficult to predict. The transition away from the CFA franc will be painful. There will be costs. There will be mistakes. There will be suffering before there is improvement. If the nations of West Africa break the peg and launch their own sovereign currencies, there will be turbulence. The value of the new currencies might fall initially. Inflation might rise as the money supply expands. The cost of imports will go up, making life harder for urban consumers who depend on imported goods. We have to be honest about this. Freedom is expensive. Sovereignty has a price. The comfort of the CFA straitjacket will be replaced by the uncertainty of independence. There will be no more guarantee from the French Treasury. If the government of Mali prints too much money to finance its budget deficit, the Malian currency will become worthless. If corruption spirals out of control, if the central bank is politicized, if populist leaders promise what they cannot deliver, the currency will crash. There will be no safety net, no backstop, no one to call when things go wrong. But there will also be opportunity, real opportunity for the first time in 60 years. With a cheaper currency that reflects the actual productivity of the economy, the cotton of Mali will be competitive on world markets. The factories of Ivory Coast will have a fighting chance against Asian imports. The Coffee growers of Cameroon will be able to sell their beans at prices that allow them to make a living. Entrepreneurs will be able to get loans to start businesses. The central banks will be able to pursue monetary policies designed for African conditions, not European conditions. They will be able to print money to finance infrastructure. They will be able to lower interest rates to stimulate growth. They will be able to manage their own exchange rates to promote exports. It will force the African governments to be responsible, to be accountable to their own people rather than to Paris. They will no longer be able to blame France for their failures. They will no longer be able to hide behind the excuse of neocolonialism. They will have to manage their own economies. They will have to build their own institutions. They will have to answer to their own people. This is the challenge of true independence. It is harder than being subordinate. It requires competence and integrity and vision. But it is the only path to dignity. The invisible empire is fading like morning mist under the rising sun. The light is hitting the hidden corners of the banking treaties, illuminating the mechanisms that were meant to remain obscure. The secret agreements that were signed in Paris and imposed on African capitals are being torn up, repudiated, rejected by a new generation that refuses to accept what their grandparents had no choice but to endure. The colonial tax is coming to an end. The tribute is being refused. The sovereignty that was promised in 1960 is finally being claimed in 2025. And for the first time in history, the money in the pocket of an African worker will truly belong to him. It will not be controlled by a central bank that answers to Paris. It will not be printed in a factory in France. It will not be subject to devaluation by French ministers who are worried about the French economy. It will be a symbol of his labor, not a symbol of his subjugation. It will be a currency that rises and falls based on African productivity, not European priorities. It will be African money, truly and fully, for better or worse. The story of the CFA Franc is a lesson for the world, a case study in how colonial systems can persist long after the colonies have supposedly been freed. It teaches us that true independence is not just about a flag or an anthem or a seat at the United Nations, not just about the symbolic trappings of sovereignty. True independence is the power to print your own money, the power to set your own value, the power to make your own mistakes and learn from them, the power to succeed or fail on your own terms. Without economic sovereignty, political independence is hollow. Without control over your currency, you are still a colony in all but name. Africa is finally claiming that power, seizing it from reluctant hands that held it for too long. The road ahead is dangerous. The path is uncertain. There will be crises and setbacks. There will be countries that fail, currencies that collapse, governments that squander the opportunity. But it is the only road that leads to the future. It is the only path that leads to genuine development, to real industrialization, to true partnership with the rest of the world based on mutual respect rather than historical domination. The invisible empire is ending. The ghost is being exorcised. The chains are being broken. And somewhere in a village in Burkina Faso or Mali or Senegal, a young person is growing up who will never know what it means to have their money controlled by a foreign power. Who will take for granted something that their grandparents could only dream of? Who will build businesses and create jobs and shape their economy based on decisions made in African capitals by African leaders, answerable to African people. That is the future that is being born. That is the promise that is finally being kept. The story is not over. It is just beginning. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.